The Soviet Union and China had been supporting the North with financial and military aid for years. If the American bombing was too fierce, they might be forced to come to its defense. After that, anything could happen. Johnson's fears that the war in Vietnam could spiral out of control were not shared by his military leaders. For more than 20 years, American military planning had given the highest priority to strategic bombers. The U.S. had built a huge force of long-range aircraft able to attack targets deep inside the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. As the conflict with North Vietnam had intensified, Strategic Air Command had modified its giant B-52s to carry conventional bombs. Although the B-52s had been stationed ready to attack North Vietnam, in the end they had been kept out of Rollingthunder. The White House believed that the massive high-altitude bombers were just too destructive. They could be seen as a massive escalation of the war. Instead, the smaller and more accurate tactical bombers would fight the strategic campaign against the North. They would also carry out their normal role by supporting ground operations in South Vietnam. It was a destructive and costly battle as both sides used ever more sophisticated weapons and tactics. In Rollingthunder, American aircraft dropped over 650,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. There were also massive operations in South Vietnam, supporting American ground troops and against communist supply lines and bases in Laos and Cambodia. The air war in Southeast Asia was more than a contest between the United States and North Vietnam. America's Cold War enemies, China and the Soviet Union, were backing the North with weapon leaders. That raised the most difficult question they had ever faced. Could the air war be won without sparking off a wider and infinitely more dangerous conflict? In late 1961, President John F. Kennedy ordered more help for the South Vietnamese government in its war against the Viet Cong guerrillas. The American airstrikes on the North had been in retaliation for particular incidents. However, many in Washington believed that bombing should have a much bigger role to play. They argued a sustained campaign of attacks could make North Vietnam stop supporting the war in the South. Johnson's biggest worry, shared by his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, was that bombing North Vietnam might spark off a much bigger war. The raids is a morale booster for South Vietnam. The Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, meant them to put on pressure, which could be stepped up gradually until the North agreed to U.S. demands. The first targets of the Rollingthunder campaign had been chosen mainly for their political and psychological impact. However, to justify the mounting toll of lost pilots and aircraft would soon emerge. The F-4 had been designed to depend for self-defense on its missiles. It had never been fitted with cannon for close-range air combat. The North Vietnamese armed forces fielded 400,000 men in 13 regular divisions. All divisions had their own anti-aircraft guns. So did the units operating in Laos, building and running the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Navy played a role in air defense too. Its fleet of East German gunboats was stationed on the sea and river approaches to important targets. From its beginnings, the North Vietnamese Air Force was part of the Army. As well as its planes and a small number of helicopters, the Air Force controlled the Anti-Aircraft Command, a specialized anti-aircraft artillery formation. It also controlled an increasingly sophisticated early warning radar system supplied by the Soviet Union and China anywhere. The plan was to coordinate the efforts of radar sites and observation posts, anti-aircraft guns, and the fighter interceptors. The planes would try to ambush the enemy, and if they couldn't shoot him down, at least force him to fly through heavy ground fire. In the early days of the air battle, close cooperation between radar, guns, and fighters would not be easy to achieve. There were too many different anti-aircraft commands. Soon, as Soviet-built anti-aircraft missiles became operational, another ingredient would be added to the already complex system. For a long time to come, North Vietnamese pilots would run a very high risk of being shot down by friendly fire. The mainstay of the North Vietnamese Air Force was the MiG-17 jet fighter. It was an aging design, a top speed of only 710 miles an hour, and it was later replaced by the incomparable MiG-21. Yet the MiG-17 was still a formidable interceptor. It was one of the most maneuverable jets ever built, and armed with 3 cannon, it was deadly in a dogfight. By now, the Air Defense Force had a large number of Soviet and Chinese anti-aircraft guns. At the start of the battle, they were still simple types with optical sights. The 23 and the 37mm twins could fire 100 rounds a minute from each barrel, but could only reach targets up to 10,000 feet. The bigger 57mm anti-aircraft guns had a ceiling of 18,000 feet. American pilots could avoid them by flying higher, but in the last moments of an attack, aircraft had to come in low. It was then that the 57mm was an extremely dangerous weapon.
Roger, sounds fine. Break 76 Bravo, this is 2-4. Shot out on the Roger east. We're going to be firing 1 loom round per minute until the flare ship gets back over. 9-8, this is 2-4. I guess you've been monitoring, but we've got that movement again out there where the loom's going in.